December 1944. The war in Europe had ground on for 6 exhausting months since the landings in Normandy. To the casual observer, the Third Reich was a corpse that just hadn't stopped twitching yet. Paris was liberated, Brussels was celebrating, and the Allied armies stood poised on the very doorstep of the German fatherland. At the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, in the opulent Trianon Palace Hotel in Versailles. The mood was one of premature victory. Champagne corks popped, officers planned their Christmas leaves in London, and the primary concern for Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower was not how to win the war, but how to manage the peace that would surely follow. The common belief, whispered in the mess halls and shouted in the headlines, was that the Germans were finished, out of fuel, out of men, and out of time. But complacency is the most dangerous narcotic in warfare. While Eisenhower wrestled with supply shortages and political squabbles between the British and Americans, a great silence had fallen over the Ardennes forest. This 80-mile stretch of dense woods and rolling hills on the border of Belgium and Luxembourg was known as the Ghost Front. It was a quiet sector, a snowy nursing home where battered American divisions were sent to lick their wounds and green units were sent to get their feet wet. It was silent, peaceful, and covered in a thick blanket of white snow. But the silence was a lie. Deep behind the tree line, hidden by the thick winter fog that grounded Allied reconnaissance planes, Adolf Hitler had assembled a Leviathan. In total secrecy, he had stripped the Eastern Front of his best units to form a massive sledgehammer, 200.000 men, 1.900 artillery pieces, and the terrifying steel giants of the 5th and 6th Panzer armies. His plan was madness, yet brilliant in its desperation. A lightning strike through the Ardennes to split the British and American armies in two. Capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. He called it Wacht dem Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. Eisenhower called it the greatest intelligence failure of the war. The nightmare began at 5:30 a.m. on December 16. The Ghost Front suddenly screamed into life. The horizon erupted with the muzzle flashes of nearly 2,000 German guns. For an hour, the earth convulsed. American soldiers of the 106th Infantry Division, boys fresh from the States who had arrived only days earlier, cowered in their foxholes as the trees around them shattered into deadly wooden shrapnel. When the shelling stopped, a ghostly, artificial moonlight pierced the pre-dawn gloom, German searchlights bouncing off the low clouds to illuminate the kill zone. And then came the sound that freezes the blood of any infantryman, the clanking, grinding roar of heavy tracks. Out of the mist rolled the King Tigers and Panthers, immune to the light American anti-tank weapons, followed by waves of white-clad stormtroopers who looked like phantoms in the snow. The American front line didn't just bend, it evaporated. Chaos reigned, communications were cut, entire regiments disappeared, rumors spread like wildfire. Rumors of German commandos dressed as American MPs misdirecting traffic, cutting phone lines, and assassinating officers. Panic, cold and sharp as the winter air, seized the army. Back in Versailles, the picture was a mosaic of confusion. Initial reports were sketchy, a patrol skirmish here, a probing attack there. Eisenhower's intelligence chief, Brigadier General Kenneth Strong, initially dismissed it, but Eisenhower, staring at the map in his office, felt the old knot in his stomach return. He looked at the locations of the attacks: St. Vith, Malmedy, Bastogne, These weren't raids, they were major arteries. By the evening of the 16th, while others were still debating, Eisenhower made the psychological leap that saved the army. He realized this was an all-out offensive. He stripped his own reserve, ordering the 7th Armored and the 10th Armored Divisions to move out immediately. But the situation worsened by the hour. On December 17, near the town of Malmedy, an American artillery observation battery surrendered to a German SS Panzer column. They were gathered in a field, hands raised, expecting to be taken prisoner. Instead, machine guns opened up. 84 unarmed Americans were mowed down in the snow. When news of the Malmedy massacre reached Eisenhower, the war changed. It was no longer just a strategic contest, it became a personal, visceral grudge match. The rage hardened the resolve of every GI on the line. They stopped surrendering, they fought to the death. By December 19, the German advance had created a massive bulge in the Allied lines. 60 miles deep, at the center of this bulge lay the critical road junction of Bastogne. Eisenhower knew that if Bastogne fell, the German panzers would have free rein to race for the coast. He played his last card, ordering the elite 101st Airborne Division to race to the town. The Screaming Eagles arrived at Bastogne just hours before the German trap snapped shut. What followed was one of the greatest epics of endurance in military history. Totally surrounded, outnumbered 5-1, and lacking winter gear, the paratroopers dug in. The temperature plummeted to 0. The fog was so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Medical supplies ran out. Surgeons were operating by candlelight, using cognac for anesthesia and bedsheets for bandages. But they held. While the paratroopers froze in Bastogne, Eisenhower faced a different kind of battle in a drafty schoolhouse in Verdun. On December 19, he summoned his top commanders. The room was cold, the only heat coming from a pot-bellied stove. But the atmosphere was scorching. British Field Marshal Montgomery was arrogant, implying the Americans had failed and that he should take command. General Omar Bradley was despondent. It was Eisenhower's moment of truth. He walked into the room not as a board chairman, but as a warlord. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster. Eisenhower declared, his blue eyes icy. There will be only cheerful faces at this table. He turned to General George S. Patton. Patton, the flamboyant cavalryman, had his Third Army engaged in a brutal fight in the Saar region. Far to the south, Eisenhower needed a miracle. George, Ike asked, how long will it take you to turn your army 90 degrees north and attack the German flank to relieve Bastogne? The room held its breath. A maneuver of that size, moving hundreds of thousands of men and vehicles over icy roads in the middle of a blizzard, should take weeks. Patton took a puff of his cigar and said, I can attack with 3 divisions on the morning of December 21st. 48 hours. The other generals laughed nervously. It was impossible. It was logistical suicide. But Eisenhower saw the fire in Patton's eyes. He knew that Patton had been secretly preparing for this. Ike nodded. Go, he said. What followed was the greatest logistical feat of the war. Patton moved 250.000 men, 133.000 vehicles, and 62.000 tons of supplies over 100 miles of ice-covered roads in total darkness. It was an intricate ballet of steel and gasoline, driven by sheer willpower. Meanwhile, inside the Bastogne perimeter, The situation was critical. On December 22, 4 German officers approached the American lines carrying a white flag and a surrender ultimatum. They told the Americans that their situation was hopeless and threatened to annihilate the town with heavy artillery. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st, listened to the translation, crumpled the paper, and muttered, "Ah, nuts," when asked what to write as an official reply. He simply said, "That first remark of mine was hard to beat." The typed response handed to the confused Germans read simply, "To the German commander." "Nuts." Signed, the American commander. It was a moment of defiance that electrified the Allied world. But defiance doesn't stop shrapnel. Bastogne was being pulverized. The paratroopers were counting their bullets. Eisenhower, trapped in his headquarters due to rumors of German assassination squads led by Otto Skorzeny roaming behind lines, felt helpless. He paced his office, chain-smoking 4 packs of cigarettes a day, staring at the gray sky, praying for the one thing he couldn't command, the weather. Then, on December 23, the miracle happened. The Russian high-pressure system moved in. The temperature dropped even lower, freezing the mud into concrete. But the skies turned a piercing, brilliant blue. "Launch everything," Eisenhower ordered. The might of the Allied air forces was unleashed. The sky filled with the roar of thousands of engines. P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons dropped from the clouds like birds of prey, their rockets smashing into the German columns that were bumper to bumper on the narrow mountain roads. The snow turned black with oil and burning steel. C-47 transport planes rained supplies onto Bastogne, colored parachutes carrying food, medicine, and ammunition drifting down like Christmas ornaments. On the ground, Patton's tanks, painted white to blend with the snow, smashed into the German flank. On December 26, a lieutenant from the 4th Armored Division broke through the encirclement and shook hands with a paratrooper from the 101st. The siege was broken. The Bulge was pierced. The battle raged on into January 1945, but the German back was broken. Hitler had gambled his last chips and lost. He had burned through his reserves of fuel, planes, and his best men. When the guns finally fell silent, Eisenhower toured the battlefield. The sights haunted him for the rest of his life. The Ardennes was a graveyard. He saw fields where hundreds of frozen bodies lay preserved in the snow. American and German alike, their faces white as marble. He saw the wreckage of towns that had stood for centuries, now reduced to rubble. He saw the 1,000-yard stare in the eyes of the 18-year-old boys who had aged a decade in a month. The Battle of the Bulge was the costliest battle in the history of the U.S. Army. Over 80,000 Americans were killed, maimed, or captured, but it was also the crucible that proved Eisenhower's greatness. He hadn't led a charge with a saber. He had managed a coalition on the brink of collapse. He had kept his head when everyone else was losing theirs. He had turned a potential catastrophe into the final nail in the Nazi coffin. As Eisenhower stood in the snow, looking east toward the Rhine River, he knew the end was near. The road to Berlin was open, but he also knew that the victory had been bought with the frozen blood of the boys who would never see another Christmas. This was his burden, the heavy, silent weight of command that he would carry long after the cheering crowds of WWII Day had gone home. The Battle of the Bulge was won, but the ghosts of the Ardennes would never truly leave him.